The journey began with an air of excitement and mystery, an undeniable pull that had lured me and my team far into the Colorado mountains. We weren't just here to capture breathtaking vistas or study flora and fauna. No, we had come with a purpose more peculiar, more unnerving. Our aim was to investigate reports of strange sightings, of shadowed figures that prowled the dense forests, slipping between ancient trees in silence. I could feel it even before we arrived. A sense that we were treading into territory that didn't quite belong to us, a place steeped in stories older than any of us could grasp. Our journey began under the thin, sharp air of early morning as we hiked from the nearest dirt road, our gear clinking and crunching along the rocky trail. I could hear the hum of my camera equipment tucked securely in my pack, the tool that would hopefully capture whatever was out there, waiting just beyond the veil of our understanding. Each step up the trail felt like peeling back a layer of normality, each footfall dragging us deeper into the wild unknown. As we walked, the familiar forest sense of pine and soil felt somehow magnified, thick with an earthy richness that bordered on ancient. A cold breeze whispered between the trees, brushing past us as if in warning, sending small shivers down my spine. I glanced back at the crew. They were just as nervous as I was, though we all wore smiles masking the subtle anxiety that tickled at the edges of our confidence. There was something electrifying in our nervousness, a reminder of why we had all chosen this life of exploring the unknown, of facing things others would sooner ignore. The forest around us was dense, each tree towering like a sentinel, branches intertwining to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into streaks of greenish light. Shadows danced on the ground, flickering as we moved, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Rationally, I knew it was just nerves. After all, we were here for the purpose of finding something strange, weren't we? Yet, the sensation was powerful, almost palpable, an intuition gnawing away at my calm. Finally, we reached the spot where we'd set up our base camp, a small clearing just off the trail that offered enough space for our tents and equipment. It wasn't much, but it would be home for the next few nights. The sound of unzipping bags and setting up tents filled the air, a strange comfort in an otherwise eerie silence. The trees formed a natural perimeter around the clearing, their thick trunks rising up like walls that encased us in their quiet, ancient embrace. Once our camp was set up, we gathered around to go over the plan. There was an unspoken tension, a sense that every glance over a shoulder or sideways glance into the trees might reveal something we weren't prepared to see. I studied each member of my team, noting the glint of eagerness in their eyes, mixed with a hint of doubt. We all knew the stories. The witnesses who claimed to have seen the figure, tall and shadowed, blending with the forest like it was part of the landscape itself. Some had called it a monster, others a spirit, but no one could agree on exactly what it was. Yet here we were, drawn by a need to see for ourselves, to seek out what others feared. As I took one last look around the camp, a shiver of anticipation crept up my spine. We had only just begun, but already it felt as if we had crossed some invisible threshold, stepping into a world that belonged to shadows and whispers. I knew, deep down, that we had entered a place where the ordinary rules didn't apply, and that whatever lay ahead was watching, waiting for us to venture closer. As night fell, the forest seemed to thicken, its shadows stretching like fingers, casting our small camp in darkness. We gathered around the single lantern we had brought, its soft, steady glow pushing back against the vast unknown that surrounded us. The familiar chatter that usually accompanied our nights in the wild was absent. Tonight, there was only silence, punctuated by the occasional crackle of dried leaves beneath our boots, or the whisper of the wind weaving through the trees. Every sound seemed magnified, each rustle and creak suddenly suspicious, as though we were not alone in our clearing. Our guide, a local man with years of experience in these woods, sat slightly apart from the rest of us, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the trees. He was a tall, lean man with lines of age and wisdom etched deep into his face, eyes sharp and distant as he took in the sounds of the night. He had a strange calmness about him, a quiet patience that felt slightly unsettling. He knew things about these woods we all suspected, things he hadn't yet shared. Just as that thought crossed my mind, he broke the silence. "You know," he began, his voice low and rough as if trying not to wake something. These mountains, they're older than we can imagine, and everything that lives here knows it. His words hung in the air, heavy with something unspoken, as he continued. I've seen things in these woods, things that don't belong in the world you and I come from, creatures that are neither animal nor spirit, but something else entirely. We all leaned in, drawn by his words, even as an uncomfortable chill spread through me. The forest around us seemed to be listening too, each branch and leaf attuned to his story. He went on, his voice almost a murmur. People say they've seen it, a figure standing just beyond the trees, watching. They say it doesn't make a sound, but its eyes, they say you can feel them, burning through the darkness, aware, curious, like it's trying to decide what you are. A twig snapped somewhere in the distance, and we all froze, heads turning in unison. The sound was faint but distinct, a sharp crack in the silent night, too deliberate to be a stray branch falling. Our eyes met in a mix of unease and excitement. Could it really be that something was out there, watching us just as the guide had said? The lantern cast its soft glow, but it was swallowed by the dark beyond our small clearing, leaving us stranded in our thoughts, each of us haunted by our imaginations. As we settled back into an uneasy silence, the night sounds slowly resumed, filling the void left by the guide's words. Somewhere an owl hooted, its call lonely and haunting, like a warning echoing through the trees. But underneath there was something else, something barely perceptible, a deep, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. I strained to hear it, but it slipped away just as I focused, leaving me questioning whether it had been real at all. Time slipped by slowly, each minute stretching as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Just as I began to feel my eyelids grow heavy, there came another sound, closer this time, a low, shuffling noise that stopped just on the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the same tension ripple through the team. We sat there, suspended in the dark, daring not to breathe, waiting for something to break the silence. But the sound never came again. Eventually, someone whispered, "Probably just a deer," but we all knew it wasn't. The guide's words echoed in my mind, creatures that are neither animal nor spirit, the kind that watches and waits. Dawn arrived slowly, peeling away the night's shadows with an indifferent gray light. Our group stirred quietly, a shared fatigue settling over us after a night spent on edge. As the forest woke up around us, bird song and the gentle rustle of leaves seemed to lift some of the weight that had pressed down on us in the darkness. But even as we went about our morning tasks, that strange sense of being watched lingered, hovering over us like a fog that refused to dissipate. Breakfast was subdued. We exchanged few words, each of us trapped in our thoughts. Every so often, I caught someone glancing out into the trees as if expecting to see a face staring back. The guide, however, ate in silence, focused, calm, seemingly unaffected by the events of the previous night. I envied his composure and wondered if he had ever experienced anything quite like this, or if somehow he knew exactly what was happening. After breakfast, we set out to examine the perimeter around our camp, searching for any signs that might explain the noises we'd heard. The morning air was brisk, the coolness sharpening our senses as we moved cautiously through the forest. The guide took the lead, his eyes scanning the ground with a practiced gaze, and soon he halted, gesturing for us to come closer. There, imprinted in the damp earth, were footprints. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, enormous, wider and deeper than any human print, with toes that spread out like a fan. Each step had left an impression as if something heavy had moved through, pressing down with an unnatural weight. I knelt to get a closer look, running my fingers lightly along the edge of the print. The detail was astonishing. The edges of the print were sharp, fresh, as though whatever had left them had passed through only hours before. My heart raced as I took in the size of each print, the sheer scale of the creature that might have left them. It was one thing to read reports, to hear the stories, but seeing the evidence there in front of me sent a chill down my spine. This was no legend or myth etched in folklore. Something real had been here, moving through the forest in the dead of night, only steps away from where we'd slept. I looked up to see the expressions on my team's faces, a mix of fascination and fear. We were all thinking the same thing, though none of us dared say it aloud. The guide, however, was unfazed. He simply nodded, as if this was exactly what he'd expected. "It knows we're here," he muttered, almost as a warning. "It's curious, that's all, but we need to respect its space." His words hung heavy in the morning air, a reminder that we were guests here, stepping into a world where we didn't belong. I felt a pang of apprehension. For the first time, I questioned whether we were ready for this. But even as doubt gnawed at me, I could feel an insatiable curiosity bubbling up, the same pull that had brought us here. The footprints seemed to draw us forward, urging us deeper into the mystery. With a silent agreement, we decided to follow the trail, pushing further into the forest where the prints led. The guide walked steadily, never glancing back, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. Every step felt significant, like we were walking along the edge of something vast and unknowable. As we moved, the forest around us grew denser, darker, the canopy thickening to shield the sky almost completely. Sunlight filtered through in fragmented beams, casting strange patterns on the ground that seemed to twist and shift as we walked. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was closing in, subtly altering itself to funnel us deeper, to draw us into whatever lay beyond. And with each step, I sensed something waiting. The deeper we trekked, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as though the very forest was bearing down upon us. Every now and then, a distant snap or rustle would send us spinning around, eyes scanning the shadows, but nothing revealed itself. The footprints continued, carving a path through the undergrowth, leading us farther from the safety of our camp and deeper into the wild heart of the mountain. It wasn't long before we encountered something else. Strange markings on the trees, claw-like grooves etched into the bark. They were arranged in patterns, slashes that ran both horizontally and vertically, as if forming a primitive, indecipherable code. Some looked old, the wood darkened with age, while others were fresh, the cuts clean and raw. I traced one of the marks with my fingers, the roughness biting into my skin as if to warn me. Whatever had left these marks was close, perhaps even closer than we realized. The guide watched us, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a subtle hint of recognition. I felt compelled to ask, "Do you know what these mean?" He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the trees as though he were reading something hidden in their scars. "They're territorial markers," he said finally, his voice low. "Creatures leave these marks to communicate, to warn others not to cross their boundaries." A cold prickle ran down my spine. If this was a boundary, we had already crossed it. Our intrusion felt more dangerous with every step, as though we were trespassing in a sacred space. I glanced back at the path we'd come from, a faint desire tugging me to turn around, to leave before we ventured too far. But my curiosity was relentless, an itch that refused to be scratched. I needed to know what lay beyond this boundary, to see for myself what had left those enormous footprints and eerie marks on the trees. The further we walked, the quieter the forest became. Even the birds, which had greeted the morning with their usual chorus, were silent now. It was as if the entire ecosystem around us held its breath, awaiting some inevitable reveal. My team and I barely spoke, each of us drawn inward, haunted by thoughts of what might be watching us, hidden just beyond the trees. After what felt like hours, we came upon a small clearing, and in its center lay something that defied explanation. Arranged in a circle were sticks and bones, meticulously placed in a pattern that looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. The bones were weathered, but they were unmistakably large, some even human-like in form. My breath caught as I scanned the sight, an involuntary shiver running through me. It felt like we were staring into a private moment, an offering, or perhaps a warning. The guide knelt down, studying the arrangement with a furrowed brow. His fingers hovered over the bones, careful not to touch. "This is unusual," he muttered, more to himself than to us. "I've seen markings before, but this..." He trailed off, his expression darkening, leaving the rest of his thoughts unspoken. I could see the unease spreading through the team. A sense of violation hung thick in the air, as though we had stumbled upon something meant only for the forest to see. I took a step back, feeling an overwhelming urge to leave, yet something rooted me in place, a compulsion to understand, to make sense of this mystery. But as we stood there, a strange sound drifted through the trees, soft at first, like a low hum carried on the breeze. It grew louder, gaining a rhythm that was almost musical, a haunting melody that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. The guide stiffened, his face going pale. He looked at each of us, his gaze hard and unyielding. "We shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever this is, it's not meant for us." As if in response to his words, the humming faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. The forest, once vibrant and full of life, now felt cold and hostile, as if the very ground beneath us was urging us to leave. Yet, even as we turned to head back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something that lingered in the shadows, silently marking our intrusion. We retreated from the clearing, our steps quickening, yet the forest seemed to stretch, each tree blurring into the next, creating a labyrinth we struggled to navigate. Every instinct in me screamed that we'd crossed a line, that something ancient and territorial was tracking our every move, waiting just out of sight. As we hurried back through the trees, the forest seemed to close in, narrowing around us with an oppressive silence that felt almost alive. My mind buzzed with images of the strange clearing, the bones, the eerie markings, and that haunting hum that had seemed to vibrate through my very bones. No one spoke, our footsteps muffled by the dense, leaf-strewn ground, each of us lost in our own uneasy thoughts. Our guide led the way, his movements quick but calculated. There was a newfound tension in his posture, a rigidity that made it clear he was no longer leading us on a casual exploration. He moved with purpose, as though aware that we had gone too far and needed to retreat before something in the forest decided otherwise. I kept close behind him, my heart racing, senses heightened, feeling as though we were being funneled, each step carrying us closer to something unknown. Then, without warning, he stopped, raising his hand in a signal for silence. We froze, barely daring to breathe. The quiet was absolute. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but the low thump of my own pulse echoing in my ears. The forest held an unnatural stillness, as if it were anticipating something, waiting to reveal a secret just out of sight. Slowly, the guide turned his head, his gaze sweeping the tree line, eyes narrowed in concentration. My skin prickled, every nerve on high alert as I followed his gaze. I scanned the shadows, each dark gap between the trees a potential hiding place. Just when I thought we might be imagining the tension, I caught it. A movement so subtle that at first I doubted my own eyes. A shape, massive and hulking, shifted just beyond the edge of our clearing. The figure was barely visible, cloaked in shadow, but there was no mistaking its size. It was taller than any person, impossibly broad-shouldered, blending seamlessly with the trees. My breath caught, and I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. There, between the trunks, something watched us, its stillness more terrifying than any sudden movement. It was the eyes that held me, two glints in the dark, reflecting a light that wasn't there. They were fixed on us, unblinking, as if assessing, calculating. The sheer intensity of that gaze pinned me in place, a sensation that was as much a physical weight as it was a mental one. I couldn't look away, caught in a grip of terror and fascination, an instinctive understanding that whatever this was, it wasn't merely an animal. The guide shifted beside me, breaking the spell. His voice was barely a whisper, strained and urgent. "Don't make any sudden moves," he murmured. "We're in its territory now. We need to show respect." A shiver crawled down my spine at his words. Respect. The concept sounded absurd, yet strangely appropriate. This creature, whatever it was, emanated a presence that demanded deference. I glanced at the others, noting the same expressions of fear and awe mirrored on their faces. We were all feeling it, this overwhelming sense of intrusion. Slowly, the guide inclined his head, a subtle bow, a gesture of acknowledgement. I hesitated, then followed his lead, nodding in a mimicry of his movements. The rest of the team did the same, our small collective motion an attempt to communicate that we meant no harm. I felt ridiculous, like an actor in a primitive ritual, yet it seemed strangely right in that moment. The creature didn't move, but I felt a shift, as though it had accepted our gesture, understood our intent. Its eyes remained fixed, unyielding, but the weight of its gaze softened just a fraction. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure melted back into the shadows, disappearing without a sound, leaving only the faint impression that we had been judged and, for now, allowed to pass. We stood in stunned silence, each of us rooted to the spot, processing what had just happened. The forest around us seemed to exhale, the silence lifting slightly as a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves. I felt an immense relief, but it was tinged with the knowledge that this wasn't over, that we had only glimpsed the edge of something much larger, something that existed beyond the realm of human understanding. And as we resumed our trek back to camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. We returned to camp in a state of muted disbelief, our movements careful and deliberate, as if any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile peace that had somehow settled over us. Though none of us spoke about it, I could sense the same lingering sensation hanging over everyone, that unshakable awareness that we had trespassed into something ancient and watchful. As we gathered around the campfire that evening, our voices were low, shadows flickering across our faces, each of us unwilling to break the silence with words that might summon it back. The guide, ever the stoic leader, poked at the fire with a stick, sending a few bright sparks up into the night. He hadn't spoken since the encounter, his jaw set in a hard line, gaze distant. I could tell he was mulling over the event, processing it in his own way, likely revisiting every detail in his mind. After a moment, he glanced up at us, his eyes sharp and measuring. "What we saw," he began, choosing his words slowly. That wasn't just some animal passing through. It was aware. It saw us, considered us. It chose to let us go. His tone was quiet, laced with a respect that bordered on reverence. I've only heard stories about things like this, things that live out here, hidden from the world. People call them legends, dismiss them as folklore. But out here, sometimes legends are real. I felt a strange pang at his words, a mixture of relief that he had acknowledged the encounter, along with a creeping unease that none of us were prepared for what we might be facing. The forest around us felt deeper than ever, as though layers of reality were peeling back to reveal a truth we weren't supposed to see. One of the crew members shifted, his face pale, brows knit in skepticism. "So you're saying that thing knows we're here? Like it's watching us?" His voice trembled slightly, and he cast a glance over his shoulder, as if expecting the creature to emerge from the darkness at any moment. The guide nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, and I don't think it likes our presence. We're outsiders here, and it knows it. That's why we need to be careful, why we can't treat this like any other expedition. If we respect its territory, maybe we'll make it through without any trouble." A heavy silence followed, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire. None of us were strangers to the wilderness. We had each spent countless nights in remote places, navigating difficult terrain and unpredictable weather. But this was different. There was no manual, no amount of experience that could prepare us for facing something beyond our understanding. As the fire burned lower, the shadows around us grew darker, stretching long fingers over the ground, crawling up the trees. The forest felt alive with a different kind of energy, one that pulsed beneath the surface, hidden from ordinary sight. I found myself leaning closer to the warmth of the fire, drawing comfort from its light, the small flame a fragile barrier against the immensity of the unknown surrounding us. The night wore on, and despite our exhaustion, sleep seemed impossible. We lay in our tents, the thin fabric walls offering little comfort, each of us wide awake, ears tuned to every sound. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves, the soft shift of branches, and the distant hoot of an owl, all blending into a background symphony that did nothing to soothe my nerves. Just as I began to drift off, lulled by the rhythmic chorus of the forest, a sound pulled me sharply back to alertness. It was subtle, almost indistinguishable from the other night sounds, but it held a weight, a purpose. A low, rhythmic knocking echoed through the woods, a steady beat that sent chills racing down my spine. I held my breath, listening, every fiber of my being tensed as the knocking grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable, an intentional signal, like someone or something was making its presence known. The others had heard it too. I could see shadows shifting in the tents as they strained to listen. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, like a message in some ancient code. It was neither frantic nor aggressive, but rather a warning. It was the forest speaking to us through whatever creature lurked within, reminding us of the invisible line we had crossed. And as I lay there, frozen with fear, I realized that perhaps this was the forest's way of testing us, of deciding whether we were worthy of stepping any further into its hidden heart. The knocking continued, a steady, rhythmic pulse that reverberated through the camp and into my bones. It was neither fast nor hurried, each beat echoing like a deliberate reminder of our place here, outsiders, intruders in a realm we couldn't understand. The sound seemed to come from all directions, blending seamlessly with the night, as if the forest itself was producing it, a heartbeat we weren't meant to hear. Beside me, the guide stirred, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light filtering through our tent. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His posture was tense, alert, shoulders set in a way that suggested he was listening intently, gauging the intent behind each thud. I wanted to ask him what he thought it meant, but the words felt thick in my throat, weighed down by fear and an instinctual need to remain silent. Speaking would break the stillness, invite the unknown closer. So I waited, barely daring to breathe. The knocking stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a vacuum in the silence, a pause that felt like a held breath. And then, just as quickly, a different sound filled the void. A faint, shuffling movement just beyond our tent, so close I could feel the ground shift beneath me. I glanced at the others, who were now wide awake, their eyes fixed on the thin walls that separated us from whatever was out there. A shadow moved across the tent, large and hulking, its outline barely visible but unmistakable. My heart hammered as I strained to make out details, but it remained elusive, a shifting shape in the dim light, more suggestion than form. The air grew thick, oppressive, pressing down on us as if the forest itself was closing in, intent on keeping us from escaping its gaze. The shadow paused, lingering just outside as if examining us, taking in every detail. I could almost feel its presence, an intelligence observing from behind those walls, calculating. It wasn't an animal's curiosity, it was something far more deliberate, like an interrogation of intent. The seconds stretched, each one amplifying the tension until I felt like I would burst from the sheer intensity of it. Then, in a move that took me completely by surprise, the guide slowly unzipped the tent. The sound felt impossibly loud in the silence, and I held my breath, afraid to even blink. He stepped out, his movements slow and careful, projecting calm that I envied. Against every rational instinct, I followed him, the cold night air pricking my skin, every sense on high alert. We stood there, side by side, facing the darkness beyond the fire's faint glow. I could see nothing but the vague outlines of trees and shadows, yet the feeling of being watched was overpowering. It wasn't just one pair of eyes. I felt as though the entire forest had come alive, observing us, evaluating us in its inscrutable way. The guide raised his hand, making a sign I didn't recognize, a small, respectful gesture toward the darkness. "We mean no harm," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We're just here to understand, to see." There was no response, no sign, only the rustle of leaves as a light breeze swept through. But the sense of pressure seemed to lessen, as though whatever was watching had acknowledged his words, even if it remained hidden. One by one, the others emerged from the tent, drawn by the guide's calm, instinctively arranging themselves in a loose circle around the fire. No one spoke. It was as if we were all waiting, hoping that silence might act as a bridge to whatever intelligence lay within the forest's depths. The night stretched around us, the shadows thickening, and though I couldn't see it, I could feel that presence lingering just beyond the firelight, still watching, still curious. Just as I thought it might withdraw, convinced of our intentions, a new sound emerged from the darkness, a low, resonant hum, like a deep, guttural chant that vibrated through the ground beneath us. It was a sound filled with ancient energy, raw and primal, something that felt less like speech and more like an expression of the forest's own consciousness. The sound wrapped around us, penetrating our thoughts, a slow rhythm that seemed to sync with our heartbeats, compelling us to listen, to understand. The hum faded, leaving us in stunned silence, and I realized my hands were trembling. It felt like we had been spoken to, not in words, but in some other language, something embedded in the roots of the earth, something older than human understanding. The guide let out a slow breath, his gaze still locked on the shadows. "It's giving us permission," he murmured, almost as if in disbelief. "But we need to be careful. This is a place of power, a place that remembers." His words sent a shiver through me, and though a part of me wanted nothing more than to leave, I also felt the thrill of revelation. We were being offered a rare glimpse, invited further into the mystery. but at what cost? The silence that followed the hum weighed on us, heavy and thick, settling like a dense fog around the camp. We remained standing, rooted to the spot, all eyes fixed on the edge of the firelight, where the forest swallowed up everything beyond a few feet. That ancient chant, still echoing faintly in my mind, seemed to linger, as if some part of the forest had etched it into our memories, refusing to let us forget. The guide moved first, breaking the spell with a deliberate exhale. He turned toward us, his face drawn and serious, shadows accentuating the lines etched deep by years in the wilderness. "We'll go back at first light," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of finality that left no room for debate. "We've been given permission, yes, but we mustn't overstay our welcome." There was a pause, a visible conflict in each of us. Leaving would mean abandoning what we had come for, turning our backs on the chance to understand this place, to document the mystery that had pulled us here in the first place. And yet the weight of the forest's warning was impossible to ignore. A reminder that we were standing on the edge of something vast and untamed, something that did not tolerate fools. As I weighed our options, one of the crew members, Sarah, stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "What if we don't leave? Just yet?" Her voice was barely a whisper, as if she feared that speaking it aloud might invoke something from the dark. "We're here to understand, right? To see for ourselves. If we leave now, we might never know what it is that watches us, what lies beyond." Her words stirred something in me, an echo of that same curiosity that had driven us all here, against the whispers and warnings. It was a siren call, a pull deeper into the unknown, the tantalizing promise of discovery. The others exchanged glances, hesitation flickering in their eyes, but I could tell they were drawn by the same thread of intrigue. We had come so far, taken so many risks, leaving now felt like surrender. The guide's face tightened, his jaw set in disapproval. "You don't understand," he said, his voice sharp yet not unkind. "This isn't just another place. It's a boundary, one that keeps our world separate from whatever lies within. Those markings, the sounds, the presence, their warnings. If we ignore them, we're breaking an ancient understanding." Sarah, unyielding, held his gaze. "But isn't that what discovery is? Crossing boundaries? We don't have to stay long, just long enough to learn. We're not here to harm, only to witness." A strained silence settled between them, and I could see the guide wrestling with his own instincts, his duty as a protector of these lands versus the allure of understanding something rare, something few had encountered and lived to tell about. Finally, he sighed, a resigned look in his eyes. "One night," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "But if we're staying, we do it on its terms, not ours. The moment things feel wrong, we leave. No questions. Agreed?" We all nodded, the unspoken thrill of staying, despite the risks, racing through our veins. The guide's gaze hardened as he looked each of us in the eye, his warning clear. "We'll make offerings, signs of respect. This isn't just another wilderness, and if we're to remain, we must show humility." The rest of the night was spent in careful preparation. We gathered small tokens from the forest, leaves, stones, anything that might be accepted as a respectful offering. Each item was placed on a flat stone near the edge of our camp, arranged in a small circle, almost like an altar. We moved in silence, each gesture deliberate, our intentions woven into each offering we placed upon the stone. It felt strange, yet natural, as if we were following instincts buried deep within, some forgotten ritual resurfacing from the past. Once the last offering was placed, we retreated to the fire, each of us watching the small altar as though expecting something to happen. The forest, for its part, remained silent, watching, but giving no sign of acknowledgement or acceptance. Yet, as the fire flickered, casting long shadows over the clearing, I felt an odd sense of calm settle over me, as if we had momentarily made peace with the unseen forces around us. Sleep came fitfully, drifting in and out with each rustle, every distant call of a night creature. But the forest held, no ominous sounds, no shadowy figures emerging from the dark. It was as if we had been granted a brief reprieve, a tentative allowance to stay, just for the night. But even as my eyes finally grew heavy, I couldn't shake a thought that lingered in the back of my mind. A quiet, nagging sense that whatever awaited us in the depths of this forest had only just begun to reveal itself. And as sleep claimed me, I wondered what the morning would bring, and whether we'd truly be allowed to leave so easily. The morning crept into the camp with an almost eerie stillness, the first light slipping through the trees in hazy bands, casting our clearing in a muted, dreamlike glow. I awoke feeling heavier than usual, the memories of the night before clinging to me like a second skin. Around me, the others stirred, stretching stiff limbs and blinking against the pale morning light, each of us looking a bit haunted, as though sleep had done little to shake off the weight of what we had witnessed. We gathered around the dying embers of the campfire, exchanging glances, but few words. No one seemed eager to discuss the sounds, the shadows, or the offerings we'd left in a silent truce with whatever inhabited these woods. It was as if speaking about it too openly would somehow bring it all rushing back, the mystery cracking wide open before we were ready to face it. Our guide was the last to join us, emerging from his tent with a solemn expression, his gaze distant. Without a word, he moved to the altar we had arranged the night before, kneeling beside it, his fingers grazing over the small stones and leaves. Something had changed. I could see it in his eyes, a tension I hadn't noticed before. He was usually so composed, an unshakable presence, but now he seemed distracted, as though he sensed something we couldn't. Finally, he stood, brushing the dirt from his hands, and turned to us, his face grave. "The forest was quiet last night," he began, his voice low. "Too quiet. It granted us a peace, yes, but it's watching, closely. We may have been permitted to stay, but that doesn't mean we're welcome." The words hung in the crisp morning air, each one landing with a weight that made my stomach twist. I glanced at the others, seeing the same uncertainty mirrored on their faces. We had agreed to stay one more night, and yet now, with the daylight filtering in, the risks felt more tangible, the warnings less abstract. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, to retreat back to the safety of civilization. But curiosity held me rooted here, an invisible tether pulling me deeper into the unknown. As we began to break camp, preparing for a day of cautious exploration, Sarah approached the guide, her face set with determination. "What's our next move?" she asked, her tone carrying a mixture of respect and urgency. The guide hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the trees, his gaze distant. "We follow the signs," he said finally, though he didn't sound entirely certain. "There's a path here, an old one, hidden but marked if you know what to look for. It might take us closer to whatever we're dealing with." He paused, searching each of our faces. "But we go quietly, carefully. This is no ordinary path. It was not made by humans. Keep your voices low, your minds clear. The forest will hear everything." With that, we set off, leaving the remnants of our camp behind as we ventured deeper into the trees. The guide led the way, his steps confident yet cautious, his gaze sharp as he followed signs only he seemed able to discern. Small scratches on the bark, subtle bends in the undergrowth, faint impressions in the soil, each one forming a trail only visible to those willing to see it. As we walked, the forest around us grew denser, darker, the trees towering like ancient sentinels, their branches interlocking overhead to create a canopy that filtered the light into a dim, ethereal green. I felt as if we were entering another realm, a hidden layer of the world where human presence was a rarity, an intrusion barely tolerated by the land itself. The silence grew oppressive, each of us moving carefully, hyper-aware of the slightest sounds. My heart beat loudly in my chest, my senses heightening with every step, alert to every rustle, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. The air seemed heavier, thick with an energy that pressed down on us, as if the forest was testing our resolve, measuring our worthiness with every step we took. Eventually, we came upon a break in the trees, a narrow, shadowed trail winding deeper into the woods, barely visible, half swallowed by the undergrowth. The guide stopped at its entrance, his face hardening as he surveyed the path. "This is it," he murmured, "the way forward." He didn't wait for questions, stepping onto the path with a solemnity that bordered on reverence. We followed, each of us glancing warily at the twisted branches and tangled roots that formed a natural archway, like a doorway into another world. The path was narrow, forcing us to walk in single file, and with each step, the air grew colder, the shadows deepening. As we moved forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not from a distance, but close, as if eyes hidden within the forest itself tracked our every movement. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I resisted the urge to look over my shoulder, sensing that whatever watched us wouldn't reveal itself until it was ready. In that moment, I understood that we had crossed a threshold, stepping fully into the forest's domain. And whatever awaited us at the end of this path would not let us turn back without a price. The path twisted and turned, winding deeper into the forest's dense heart. The ground beneath our feet softened, coated in layers of moss and damp earth, muffling each step, as if the forest itself were swallowing any trace of our presence. The shadows grew thicker, darker, pressing close from every angle, creating an oppressive atmosphere that made the air feel thick, almost viscous. The towering trees loomed above us, their twisted branches stretching like gnarled fingers toward each other, forming a near-complete canopy that allowed only the faintest traces of daylight to seep through. Our guide moved with a quiet, measured confidence, his gaze sharp, picking up on markers we couldn't see. He would pause occasionally, his fingers tracing marks etched into bark or subtle depressions in the soil, each one seemingly leading us forward. Yet even he appeared more cautious now, his body tense, as if he felt the unseen eyes upon us just as keenly as I did. A sudden faint sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on wood. It was distant, barely audible, but unmistakable, each beat echoing eerily through the forest. I froze, holding my breath, the others around me halting in unison as we strained to locate the source. The sound came in intervals, deliberate like a signal, but it was impossible to tell how far it was or what might be creating it. Our guide gave us a warning look, his eyes narrowing as he held up a hand, urging silence. We remained still, listening to the rhythm, a subtle warning that seemed woven into the forest's fabric. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a kind of language, a message we couldn't interpret, but that carried an unmistakable weight. The forest was speaking to us, measuring our intentions, our worth. After a long pause, the guide motioned us forward again, and we resumed our slow, cautious steps. The tapping continued intermittently, as if marking our progress, each beat a reminder that we were not alone, that this ancient place was aware of our intrusion. Every instinct in me screamed to turn back, to leave before the presence lurking in the shadows revealed itself. But something deeper, curiosity, pride, maybe even defiance, urged me onward, matching the silent resolve in my companions' faces. Ahead, the path narrowed further, almost disappearing beneath a tangle of roots and undergrowth. The guide stopped, studying the way forward with a frown, then stepped aside, gesturing for us to remain still. He knelt, examining a fresh set of tracks imprinted in the mud. A set of enormous footprints, each toe splayed wide, claw-like marks trailing behind. The prints were unmistakably fresh, pressed deep into the ground with a weight that seemed unnatural. "Look at these," he murmured, more to himself than to us, his brow furrowed with concern. It was just here. The realization sent a chill through me. Whatever we were tracking, or that was tracking us, was not only real but close, far closer than I dared imagine. The enormity of the prints suggested a creature of immense size, yet the lack of any noise, any hint of movement, was unsettling. It moved with a stealth and intelligence that defied natural logic, as though the forest itself cloaked its every step. Just then, a branch snapped behind us, sharp and sudden, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. We spun around, hearts racing, searching the dense shadows, but nothing revealed itself. My pulse thundered as I scanned the darkness, half expecting to see a massive shape looming out of the trees. But there was only silence, the forest standing still, holding its secrets close. The guide straightened, his face pale, eyes narrowed with a mixture of fear and resolve. "It's testing us," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Seeing how far we'll go, how much we're willing to endure. This is no ordinary creature." None of us replied. There was nothing to say, no words that could capture the deep, primal fear that clawed at each of us. We were standing on the edge of something vast and incomprehensible, a force that moved silently through the forest, watching, waiting. After a moment, the guide turned back toward the path, motioning us to follow. His face was set in grim determination, yet I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. We were committed now, too far in to turn back, yet every step felt like it was bringing us closer to an encounter we weren't prepared for. We moved forward, each step quieter than the last, as though instinctively trying to minimize our presence. And in the silence that stretched around us, the forest seemed to breathe, a low hum that resonated from deep within its heart, growing stronger with each step we took, as if summoning us toward the truth that lay hidden within its shadows. The deeper we went, the more the forest transformed, shedding any semblance of familiarity. The trees grew twisted, their trunks warped and gnarled, their branches heavy with thick moss that draped down like curtains, muffling even the smallest sound. The light grew dimmer, filtered through layers of leaves and mist, casting everything in an otherworldly glow. Shadows slithered between the trunks, shifting and reforming, as if the forest itself were breathing, alive with some hidden intent. Our guide's pace slowed, his usual confidence tempered by a wary respect. He was no longer just leading us, he was navigating, feeling his way through the unseen forces that seemed to saturate this part of the woods. I could see the strain in his face, the tension in his shoulders, his eyes scanning every detail with an intensity I'd never seen before. It was as if he was searching not only for a path, but for any sign, any clue that might hint at the nature of the presence that stalked these woods. The rest of us moved in silence, each of us caught in our own quiet fear, the weight of the forest pressing down like an invisible hand. Every now and then, I felt an urge to look back, a gnawing sensation that something was there, just behind us, watching. But each time I turned, I found only darkness, the trees forming an impenetrable wall, cloaking whatever may have been lurking beyond. As we pushed on, we began to find more signs, scattered along the trail like breadcrumbs leading us deeper. Strange arrangements of sticks and stones littered the path, symbols carved with a precision that defied natural forces. Some of them resembled crude figures, humanoid shapes with elongated limbs and hollow spaces where eyes might have been. Others were more abstract, intricate spirals and interwoven circles, each one placed with meticulous care, as if meant to convey something beyond our comprehension. "What do you think these mean?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, as though speaking louder might somehow summon whatever had left these markers. The guide paused, studying one of the figures, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "These aren't random," he murmured, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "They're warnings, or perhaps invitations, signs to mark a boundary." "Then why are we crossing it?" Another crew member muttered, half joking but with an edge of real concern in his voice. The guide didn't answer, his gaze lingering on the strange symbols. I could see the conflict in his expression, the push and pull between the desire to uncover the mystery and the instinct to turn back. But he continued forward, his resolve firm, and we followed, bound by our shared curiosity and the quiet thrill of discovery that hung in the air. The forest seemed to grow denser, the air thick with an almost palpable energy that hummed just beneath the surface. I felt a pressure in my chest, a heaviness that intensified with each step, as if we were descending into a place that was not meant for us. The path wound deeper, taking us to a narrow clearing encircled by trees so old and massive they seemed more like ancient pillars than mere plants. The trunks were lined with strange, sprawling patterns that looked like veins, running from root to branch in an intricate network that pulsed faintly with a greenish glow. In the center of the clearing stood a stone structure, small, unassuming, but undeniably deliberate. It looked like an altar, rough-hewn from stone, weathered by time, but bearing symbols similar to those we'd seen along the path. I could feel a pull toward it, an urge to approach, to understand, but the sense of dread was overwhelming, a primal instinct urging me to stay back. The guide walked forward, his steps measured and respectful, his hand outstretched as he approached the altar. He examined the markings, running his fingers over them as if trying to decode an ancient language. This is older than anything I've seen," he murmured, his voice filled with awe, a place of reverence or sacrifice. As the words left his lips, a cold gust swept through the clearing, stirring the branches, sending shivers through us. The shadows around us deepened, coiling tightly around the trees, their edges blurring, shifting, as if the forest itself had taken offense at our intrusion. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon us, a collective presence that seemed to radiate from the ground, the trees, the very air around us. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl, rumbling from the depths of the forest. It wasn't loud, but it held an authority, a power that silenced even the trees. Every muscle in my body froze, my heart thudding against my ribs as I scanned the shadows, searching for the source. Our guide took a step back from the altar, his face pale, his eyes wide. "We're not alone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Whatever this place is, it's guarded." He turned to us, his expression serious, almost pleading. "We need to leave, now." But before we could react, the growl sounded again, closer this time, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet, a warning woven into the earth itself. We were trespassing on hallowed ground, a place hidden and protected, a realm that demanded respect or retribution. And as we began to back away, I realized that leaving this place would not be as simple as retracing our steps. We had crossed a line, and the forest was not prepared to let us go so easily. The growl reverberated through the clearing, a sound that resonated not just in our ears, but in the very core of our beings, as if the forest itself were voicing its displeasure. Instinctively, we moved back, our feet stumbling over roots and loose stones as we tried to retreat without turning our backs on the ominous darkness surrounding us. The air had grown thick, each breath laden with an earthy dampness that made it feel as though we were inhaling the forest itself, a blend of soil, decay, and something else, something ancient, almost feral. The guide took the lead, his voice a tense whisper as he directed us toward the path we had come from. "Stay close, keep your heads down," he murmured, his words laced with urgency. He looked around, eyes wide and sharp, as if anticipating an attack from any direction. "We've seen too much. We need to leave now." But as we tried to retrace our steps, the forest seemed to shift, its familiar landmarks dissolving into a maze of identical trunks and dense shadows. Every tree, every root seemed to have shifted, rearranging itself into an unfamiliar landscape that bore no trace of the path we'd taken. Panic simmered just beneath the surface as we searched desperately for any sign, any marker that could guide us back to safety. It was as if the forest itself was twisting, subtly blocking our way, transforming into a labyrinth that coiled tighter with each step we took. Sarah, her voice tight with fear, whispered from behind me, Are we lost?" Her question hung in the air, the words themselves almost taboo, as if admitting the truth might seal our fate. The guide clenched his jaw, his face grim. "It's not that we're lost. The forest, it's shifting, moving. It doesn't want us to leave." A shiver ran through me, the realization chilling. The forest had taken on a life of its own, and we were caught in its grip, each step pulling us further into its clutches. I felt as though we were intruders who had ventured too deep, disturbing something that had lain undisturbed for centuries. Just then, a strange noise drifted through the trees, a faint whispering that seemed to come from all around us. It was more than just wind rustling through leaves. It was rhythmic, almost melodic, rising and falling like a chant spoken in a language beyond human understanding. The sound sent a prickling sensation across my skin, a visceral warning that we were not alone. The guide motioned for us to stop, his face tense as he listened intently. "Don't move," he breathed, his voice barely a murmur. It's aware of us." The chanting grew louder, each syllable curling through the air like tendrils of smoke, wrapping around us, filling the clearing with an oppressive weight. It felt as if we were standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, a presence just out of sight, lingering within the trees. The chanting held a dark allure, each syllable pulling at the edges of my mind, compelling me to listen, to step closer, as if it were inviting us deeper into its hidden heart. The guide snapped his fingers in front of my face, breaking the spell. "Stay focused," he warned, his eyes dark and fierce. "That's how it lures you in. It wants us to follow, but we can't. We need to resist." His words jolted me back to awareness, the danger of our situation settling over me like a heavy cloak. Whatever lay in the depths of this forest was no ordinary creature, no legend or myth born of human fears. This was something ancient, an entity that had lived within these woods long before humans had named them, a force that didn't welcome trespassers. Without another word, we continued moving, each step taken in strained silence, our senses hyper-aware. The chanting faded, but the oppressive feeling remained, clinging to us like a second skin, urging us to turn back, to respect the boundaries we had already overstepped. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A flicker of movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. It was brief, almost too fast to register. But it left an impression, a towering figure with elongated limbs and eyes that seemed to glow faintly, reflecting an unnatural light that wasn't there. My heart pounded, and I stumbled, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as I looked to the others to see if they had noticed it too. The guide's gaze was fixed on the same spot, his face drained of color, his expression one of raw fear. He took a shaky breath, then turned to us, his voice low and strained. "We don't look back. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, you keep moving forward. Understand?" We nodded, our faces pale, understanding that he was no longer speaking in metaphors. Whatever this thing was, it was close, close enough to reach out, to pull us into its grasp. The forest had ceased to be a place of nature. It had become a trap, a labyrinth, each step leading us further from the safety of reason and light. We pressed on, each footfall carrying a newfound weight, a fear that seeped into our bones, gnawing at our resolve. The whispers, the shadows, the chanting, it all coalesced into an overwhelming sense that we were being watched, measured, and judged. And as we moved deeper, I felt an unshakable certainty settle within me. We had crossed into a place that didn't want us, a world woven from shadows and ancient memories that could swallow us whole, leaving no trace that we had ever been here. We moved forward in tense silence, each step feeling like a small betrayal to the world we'd known before. The forest had transformed fully into something sentient, something that watched and waited with patient menace. I tried to quiet my racing thoughts, focusing instead on the crunch of the earth beneath my boots, the weight of my pack, the steady sound of my breath, anything to anchor me against the terrifying vastness pressing in from all sides. The guide led us in a winding pattern, as though he were attempting to evade a pursuer. His movements were methodical but quick, his eyes flicking constantly toward the shadows, his face pale and drawn with a grim resolve. Each of us had grown quieter, more withdrawn, sinking into our thoughts, every instinct urging us to be as unobtrusive as possible. I could feel it in my bones. We were being hunted, though by what, I couldn't say. We hadn't traveled far before the whispers began again, low and haunting, drifting through the trees like smoke. Unlike before, they seemed sharper, more directed, like voices just on the edge of perception, calling, urging us closer to some unseen destination. The whispers seemed to vibrate, as if infused with a dark energy, echoing in my mind and filling my chest with a cold dread that made each breath feel shallow and insufficient. Sarah, who had been walking beside me, suddenly stumbled, clutching at her head. Do you hear that?" she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, as though she were looking through me, staring at something that only she could see. I placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her, feeling my own fingers trembling. "Yes, I hear it. Just stay focused. Keep moving." The guide turned back, his face taut with concern, but he nodded for us to continue. "Don't listen too closely," he advised, his voice a strained whisper. "They're trying to pull us in. That's how it starts." It felt absurd, irrational, yet the truth in his words was undeniable. The forest had a mind of its own, and whatever forces resided here knew we were intruders. The whispers felt as if they were burrowing into my mind, probing, testing the limits of my will. I shook my head, trying to clear it, forcing myself to think of something solid and familiar. Memories, faces, sounds from home, anything to block out the insidious call weaving through the trees. But just as I managed to steady myself, the whispers shifted, evolving into something almost recognizable. Fragments of words, voices that sounded human yet laced with a raw, ancient timbre. "Why are you here?" the voices seemed to ask, the words slow and distorted, stretched as if coming from the depths of a vast, dark space. The question hung in the air, a demand that seemed to echo within each of us, unanswerable yet relentless. The guide's face turned pale, his jaw tight as he listened, his eyes dark with recognition. "It knows," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "It knows why we're here, and it wants us to leave." A chill ran down my spine, an instinctive understanding that the forest wasn't asking for answers. It was testing our resolve, pushing us to admit our trespass. We had come here out of curiosity, out of an arrogant need to probe into places that weren't ours, and now, whatever inhabited this place, was forcing us to confront the depth of our intrusion. As we continued forward, a sudden rustling sounded nearby, breaking the silence in an explosion of movement. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned, expecting to see the monstrous shadow that had haunted our steps. But instead, a large buck burst from the undergrowth, its eyes wide with terror, its powerful legs carrying it in panicked leaps away from us and deeper into the forest. The sight of the buck, so wild and desperate, filled me with an overwhelming dread. It was fleeing something unseen, something that lurked within the shadows that even the animals feared. I felt the weight of that fear settle over us, thick and suffocating, as though the forest itself were pressing down, warning us of the dangers we couldn't yet see. The guide tightened his grip on the walking stick he'd been using to steady himself. His voice dropped to a low murmur. "It's not just us that feel it," he said, almost to himself. "The animals, they sense it too. There's something here that shouldn't be." We resumed our trek, each of us moving faster, compelled by a shared urgency, a need to leave this place that felt so alive with malevolent intent. My mind raced, torn between a curiosity that wanted to understand the mysteries of this forest and a primal urge to escape, to survive whatever was creeping closer. And as we continued, the whispers returned, relentless and haunting, seeping into our thoughts, twisting and transforming our sense of reality. I could feel the boundary between our world and the forest's hidden depths blurring, merging, until it was almost impossible to distinguish one from the other. This was no longer a journey, it was a descent, a spiral into something old and forbidden, a place where every step felt like it would be our last. The forest was alive, pulsing with a purpose of its own, and it was only just beginning to show us its true face. We pressed onward, our steps quickening, the unspoken fear mounting with each rustle, each shadow that seemed to stretch out and curl toward us. The whispers had subsided into a low hum, a steady vibration that seemed to resonate with the very ground beneath us. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was attuning itself to us, like a creature that had found its prey and was now gauging how best to strike. Ahead, the guide stopped abruptly, holding up a hand to silence us. We froze, our breaths shallow as we strained to hear whatever he was listening to. The silence was suffocating, thick and all-consuming, as if the forest itself were waiting, hanging on the edge of some silent revelation. Then I heard it, a faint trickling sound, the murmur of water hidden somewhere in the dense underbrush. Relief prickled through me. The presence of water felt almost mundane, an anchor to the familiar in this unrelenting strangeness. The guide motioned for us to follow as he moved toward the sound, his steps cautious, his gaze sharp as it cut through the shadows. We emerged from the trees into a small clearing where a narrow creek wound its way through the forest floor, its water dark and sluggish beneath a canopy that blocked out nearly all light. The air was cooler here, tinged with the scent of damp moss and wet stone, but it did little to ease the tension coiling within us. The creek itself was strange, unsettling in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The water was almost unnaturally dark, its surface still despite the gentle flow, as though something beneath it was absorbing all light. The sight was hypnotic, drawing me in with a quiet allure that felt both comforting and menacing, a silent invitation to look deeper, to see what lay hidden below. The guide bent down, scooping up a handful of the water, letting it slip through his fingers as he muttered something under his breath. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze distant, as though he were weighing some unspoken question, wrestling with an internal struggle that none of us could see. "Is it safe?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced warily at the water, her expression mirroring my own unease. The guide straightened, his face unreadable as he looked at us. His eyes shadowed. "Safe? No. But it's necessary." He gestured to the creek, a seriousness in his tone that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "This isn't just a stream. It's part of the boundary, one that separates us from whatever lies beyond." The words settled over us like a shroud, heavy and inescapable. The boundary. We had already crossed so many lines, stepped over invisible thresholds that separated the ordinary from the unknown, and yet here we were, standing at the edge of another. There was a temptation in his words, a challenge that resonated with the curiosity burning within each of us. But something in his eyes warned us that this was different, that this was not a line to cross lightly. The guide took a step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth along the creek's edge. "If we choose to follow this," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "We will be leaving the safety of our world, crossing a threshold that we may not be able to return from." A chill rippled through me, the finality of his words cutting through the fog of fascination that had clouded my mind. And yet, despite every warning, despite the primal instinct screaming at me to turn back, I felt a pull, an undeniable urge to see, to know what lay beyond the veil. The others exchanged hesitant glances, each of us weighed down by the same conflict. But the choice felt inevitable, as though something larger than ourselves had already set us on this path, and there was no deviating from it now. As if sensing our unspoken decision, the guide nodded, his face a mixture of grim determination and reluctant acceptance. "Then we go together," he said, his voice steady, though there was a flicker of sadness in his gaze, as though he were already mourning what this journey would demand from us. He stepped into the creek, the dark water swirling around his boots with a slow, almost unnatural movement, as though it were alive, reacting to his presence. One by one, we followed, the cold water lapping around our ankles, chilling us to the bone. I felt a strange tingling sensation where it touched my skin, an awareness that this water was not ordinary, that it was part of the very fabric of the forest's power. The moment we crossed to the other side, a palpable shift settled over us. The forest around us seeming to draw closer, its shadows lengthening, its whispers growing louder, as if we had passed into its very heart. The air was thick, heavy with an energy that felt almost electric, pulsing with a life of its own. And as we took our first steps forward, I realized that whatever awaited us beyond this final boundary was more than just a creature, more than a legend. It was a force that had existed long before our understanding, a mystery that had patiently awaited our arrival, and I could feel it stirring, awakening to greet us. Crossing the creek felt like stepping into a different realm entirely. The air on this side of the water was colder, sharper, carrying a strange tang that stung my lungs as I breathed it in. Every sound seemed heightened, amplified, each rustle, every footstep sinking into the earth with a muted crunch that seemed to echo far beyond the immediate area. The forest's quiet was oppressive, an unnatural silence that felt purposeful, as though even the usual sounds of life dared not intrude here. Our guide was tense, his shoulders hunched slightly as he moved forward with deliberate, measured steps, glancing back only once to ensure we were all following. His face was drawn, pale, yet his eyes held a gleam of resolve that bordered on defiance. This was a path he knew, or at least one he recognized, and I could tell he felt the weight of responsibility as our leader. The boundary we just crossed wasn't just a line in the forest, it was a gateway, an entrance into something ancient, a place that did not welcome strangers. The shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, stretching across our path in twisted, sinuous patterns, forming shapes that played tricks on the mind. I caught glimpses of movement from the corners of my eyes, dark forms slipping silently between the trees, figures that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. My pulse quickened, each fleeting image sending a chill up my spine, a creeping sensation that grew with every step. Whatever those shapes were, they were watching us, moving in tandem with our progress, part of the forest's dark pulse. Sarah, just behind me, suddenly clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my sleeve. "Do you see them?" she whispered, her voice trembling, eyes wide as they scanned the tree line. "They're everywhere," I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, just stay close. They haven't come near us." I was trying to reassure her, but the truth was, my own heart pounded against my ribs, each beat a reminder of how isolated we were, how deep we'd gone into a place we didn't understand. The guide paused up ahead, his gaze fixed on something just beyond a particularly dense patch of trees. He raised a hand, signaling for us to stop, his posture tense as he peered into the shadows. I squinted, trying to see what he saw, and as my eyes adjusted, a strange structure came into focus. A formation of stones, stacked high and covered in dark moss, arranged in a rough circle around a central stone that jutted out from the ground like a crude altar. The air around the stones felt charged, buzzing with an energy that made my skin prickle. The stones weren't merely old, they felt timeless, as though they had been placed here in a time before memory, before human hands had learned to shape stone. And the arrangement was precise, intentional, giving the unsettling impression that this was not simply a place of worship, but a place of ritual, a site where something ancient and powerful had once been summoned or contained. The guide moved toward the circle, his movements careful, almost reverent. "This place, it's a threshold," he murmured, half to himself. "It's as though something lives here within the stones, bound to them." I felt a shiver run through me as I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of how the shadows seemed to pool here, drawn to the stones, as though held in place by some invisible force. The others gathered close, forming a loose ring around the guide as he studied the formation, each of us unwilling to step closer, sensing the unseen boundary around the stones. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the clearing, cold and biting, stirring up leaves and dust. The wind carried with it a faint, haunting sound, like a low moan that rose and fell in the air, echoing through the trees. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, my senses screaming that we were not alone. It was as though the forest itself had drawn a breath, filling the space around us with a presence that was both formless and deeply, unsettlingly aware. The guide turned back to us, his face pale, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is a place of power, a place that remembers." His words sent a chill through the group, a sense of collective dread settling over us. I felt a strange pull toward the stones, a compulsion to step closer, to reach out and touch them, to feel whatever secrets they held within their cold, ancient surface. But the guide's warning echoed in my mind, grounding me, reminding me that this was no ordinary place, that whatever had been summoned or bound here did not tolerate the curiosity of trespassers. The shadows around the stones seemed to shift, deepening, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something move within them. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing between the stones, watching us with a gaze that felt like ice sliding down my spine. I blinked, and it was gone, but the sensation lingered, a mark left by something that did not belong to our world. We all felt it, that silent, ominous watchfulness pressing down upon us, daring us to draw closer to see what lay beyond. And as we took a collective step back, I knew that the forest had brought us here to show us something we might not survive seeing. We lingered at the edge of the stone circle, each of us rooted in place by a mixture of dread and awe. The shadows around the stones seemed to pulse, breathing in and out with a rhythm that matched our own heartbeats, pulling us into an unnatural synchrony with the forest. It felt as though we were standing on the precipice of a truth too immense for our minds to grasp, as if one step closer would unravel the boundary between our world and whatever ancient power lay buried here. The guide's gaze remained fixed on the stones, his expression hard, almost reverent, as if he were looking upon something holy yet utterly terrifying. He took a slow, steadying breath, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "This place, it's more than a boundary. It's a prison." He looked back at us, his face pale, eyes wide with something between awe and horror. Something was bound here, held within these stones, and were standing at the edge of its domain. The air around us felt thicker, as if it had taken on weight, pressing against our skin, filling our lungs with a heaviness that went beyond mere atmosphere. Every instinct in me screamed to turn back, to leave this place untouched, but something about his words held me, an unbearable curiosity that gnawed at the edges of my fear. Sarah, her face pale and tight with barely suppressed panic, stepped back, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "If it's a prison, then why are we here? Why would we ever come this close?" Her voice cracked, carrying the terror we all felt, her gaze darting from the stones to the dark woods surrounding us, as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. The guide looked at her, his face solemn. Sometimes things that are contained want to be remembered, and sometimes they call to us. He paused as if weighing each word carefully. "The forest didn't bring us here by accident. It led us, called us even. It wants us to understand something." The words hung in the air, filling the clearing with a grim understanding. Whatever lay beyond those stones was more than a creature, more than a legend. It was a force, a presence that had been anchored here, waiting, perhaps even yearning for someone to witness its existence. I felt a pull, a compulsion that grew stronger the longer we stood there, as though an invisible hand were reaching out, beckoning us forward, tempting us to step over the edge. Just then, a faint noise rose from the direction of the stones, a low guttural hum that vibrated through the ground, seeping into our bones. It was not human, nor did it resemble any animal I'd ever heard. It was a sound older than language, a resonant tone that seemed to well up from the earth itself. The hum grew louder, rhythmic, almost chanting, as though the forest itself were giving voice to something unspeakable, something that had been dormant and was now awakening. The guide stiffened, his face going pale, his eyes fixed on the stones as the hum intensified, becoming a low, thrumming beat that echoed through the trees. He glanced back at us, his expression urgent. We need to leave. Now. But the moment he spoke, the shadows around the stones deepened, shifting to form a shape, a dark, towering figure that seemed to emerge from the stones themselves, rising slowly as if unfolding from the earth. Its form was indistinct, more a silhouette than a solid shape. Yet there was an undeniable intelligence in its posture, a deliberate, ancient awareness that seemed to probe each of us, measuring, assessing. We froze, our bodies rooted to the ground as the figure seemed to take in each of us with a gaze that felt like a physical force, a weight pressing down, demanding our attention. The guide tried to speak, his voice caught in his throat, his hand clenching at his side as he fought to maintain his composure. "Do not run," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "It's watching, but it hasn't decided yet." The figure began to shift, its form moving like smoke, dark tendrils stretching out from the center, flickering in and out of focus. I felt an overwhelming urge to look away, to shield myself from the sight, but I couldn't move, trapped by the presence that filled the clearing. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air, and I felt it resonating inside me, tugging at something primal, something buried deep within that recognized this ancient force as both terrible and mesmerizing. The shadows flickered, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw faces within the dark, a multitude of eyes, mouths stretched in expressions of pain, of longing, as though they were trapped within the figure, part of its essence. The sight sent a jolt of fear through me, my heart racing as I realized that whatever this was, it held fragments of lives, of souls that had come too close. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to recede, folding back into the stones, sinking slowly into the ground as the hum faded, leaving an echo that lingered in the air long after the shadows had vanished. The silence that followed was deafening, each of us frozen, caught in the aftermath of what we had just witnessed. The guide looked at us, his expression haunted, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were spared," he said, his words tinged with a reverence I had never heard before. "But we cannot stay." And as we turned to leave, I could still feel that presence pressing upon me, a reminder of the boundary we had crossed, of the ancient force that had, for one brief moment, allowed us to glimpse its face. We moved away from the stones in a hurried silence, our breaths shallow, hearts hammering with a mixture of fear and awe. The memory of the dark figure lingered, an after-image imprinted on my mind, vivid and unshakable. I could still feel the weight of its gaze, the hum of its ancient energy reverberating in my bones, as though the forest had infused us with a sliver of its unfathomable power. The guide led us back along the twisted path, his steps quick and deliberate, his face tight with concentration, as if he feared that slowing down might give the forest a chance to reconsider letting us leave. The dense canopy above felt heavier than before, casting deeper shadows that seemed to pulse and shift as we walked, like living things that monitored our progress. It was as though the forest was aware of us now, fully awake, its patience thinning as we retreated from the heart of its mysteries. I could feel a strange tension in the air, a sensation that something immense and ancient had stirred within the earth and was watching us from a distance, biding its time. None of us spoke, each of us caught in the thrall of what we had just seen. I glanced at Sarah, whose face was drawn, eyes wide and glassy with shock. She met my gaze, and in her expression I saw the same haunted understanding that lingered in my own thoughts. We had witnessed something that defied comprehension, a glimpse into a world that wasn't meant for human eyes. Just as the path began to widen, giving us a faint glimmer of hope that we were nearing the creek and perhaps the safety of our familiar reality, a low, rumbling sound echoed from behind us. It was subtle at first, a vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself, sending small stones trembling in the soil. But then it grew louder, more insistent, like a heartbeat building in intensity, filling the air with a pulsing energy that quickened our pace, our movements now frantic. The guide looked over his shoulder, his face ashen. "Keep moving," he hissed, his voice laced with urgency. "It's following." The realization struck me like a jolt of electricity, propelling me forward as fear flooded my veins. Whatever force we had encountered wasn't content with our retreat. It was pursuing us, its presence swelling like a storm gathering on the horizon. The forest around us seemed to warp, the trees leaning in, their twisted branches forming shapes that loomed and reached as though trying to trap us within their grasp. A sudden gust of icy wind whipped through the trees, bringing with it a faint whispering that slithered through my mind, fragments of words just beyond understanding. It was the same voice from before, that dark and ancient chant, now woven with something new. An urgency, a demand that pressed into my mind like a weight. The whispering grew louder, its tone sharper, cutting through my thoughts with a clarity that felt invasive, like an unwanted hand rifling through the most private parts of my mind. "Why? Do you run?" The words echoed, each syllable resonating with a power that forced me to stumble, my steps faltering as I struggled to regain control. The guide grasped my arm, steadying me, his grip firm, eyes fierce. "Don't listen to it," he commanded, his voice low and steady, pulling me from the grip of that hypnotic whisper. "It's trying to draw you back. Ignore it." I nodded, swallowing hard, fighting to block out the haunting voice that seemed to coil around my thoughts, whispering, beckoning. The others glanced back nervously, their faces mirroring the same dawning terror that had rooted itself in me. We had ventured too close to something that wasn't meant for human understanding, and now it refused to let us go. Just as we broke into a small clearing, the rumbling ceased, the air thickening in a sudden, unnatural stillness that made the forest feel as though it had taken a breath and was holding it, waiting for us to make the next move. The silence was profound, filling the clearing with a weight that pressed down on us, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Then, from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, I saw a flicker of movement. Dark shapes gathered at the boundary of the trees, their forms shifting, indistinct but unmistakably watching. There was a sense of awareness emanating from them, an intelligence that evaluated us, that seemed to weigh our worth and intentions as though debating our right to leave. The guide's voice cut through the silence, low but commanding. "Walk, don't run. Keep your eyes forward. We're almost there." His words steadied me, snapping me back to the present, the urgency in his tone propelling us forward, even as the shadows seemed to close in. Step by step, we moved toward the edge of the clearing, the shapes in the shadows watching, their presence intensifying, growing thicker, until it felt as though the entire forest had gathered to bear witness to our retreat. Each step was a silent plea, a hope that we would be allowed to leave, that whatever we had glimpsed would be satisfied to let us return to the world we knew. And as we crossed the threshold back onto the familiar ground, I felt the oppressive weight lift, the forest releasing us, its attention receding like a wave, pulling back into the depths. But even as we finally broke into a run, I knew that we had not left unscathed, that we had taken something of this place with us, a memory, a mark, a reminder that we had trespassed and been forever changed. We pushed onward, each step carrying us farther from that haunted clearing, yet the weight of what we had encountered clung to us like a second skin. The trees began to thin, patches of sunlight filtering down through gaps in the canopy, yet even in the soft morning light, I felt no relief. Every sound, every crackle of leaves underfoot felt magnified, as though the forest itself were reminding us that we were not free, not yet. The guide led us with a determined silence, his face set, his eyes dark and hollow. Whatever resolve he had gathered over years of experience in the wilderness was thinning. I could see it in the way his shoulders hunched slightly, the way his gaze flicked constantly over his shoulder, scanning the shadows. He didn't have to say it. I knew he feared that the forest, or whatever inhabited it, hadn't truly let us go. A sudden rustling in the underbrush brought us all to a halt, each of us frozen, holding our breaths, muscles tensed as we listened. But the noise faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only the eerie, unnatural silence in its place. I exchanged a glance with Sarah, her eyes wide and filled with a haunting mixture of terror and relief, as if she couldn't decide whether to be grateful or horrified that the forest seemed determined to let us go on its own terms. We continued forward, and the path became more familiar. The creek from earlier now visible just ahead, its dark waters glinting beneath the dappled light. Relief surged through me at the sight of it. The creek represented a boundary we understood, something real and tangible in a landscape that had twisted and blurred into a nightmarish maze. Crossing it felt like a return to sanity, a step back into the world we had known before the forest had revealed its hidden depths. The guide paused at the creek's edge, his gaze fixed on the dark, swirling water. He turned to us, his face drawn with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. "Crossing here," he began, his voice low, "isn't just leaving a place, it's leaving a presence. Remember, you carry this with you now. This forest, it won't let go entirely." The words hung heavily in the air, and as I looked into the water, I could almost see something reflected there, shapes shifting, figures moving just beyond the surface, as though the creek held fragments of the memories we were carrying away. Taking a steadying breath, I stepped forward, feeling the cold water wrap around my ankles, biting into my skin like an unwelcome reminder. One by one, we crossed the creek, each of us silent, absorbed in our thoughts. As I stepped onto the opposite bank, I felt a subtle but distinct shift, a lightness that seemed to ease the tension in my muscles, the oppressive weight of the forest lifting slightly. But even as I felt the relief, a nagging awareness lingered, a faint echo of the ancient presence that had watched us, judged us, marked us. The guide glanced back at the dark forest, his face etched with exhaustion and something deeper, something resembling respect. "This isn't just a place," he murmured. "It's a memory, a living one, and we are part of it now." He scanned our faces, his eyes somber. "Don't speak of it to others. They wouldn't understand, and the forest doesn't tolerate its secrets being shared." His words carried a gravity that struck me, sinking deep into my mind. I realized with a cold certainty that this experience would become a part of each of us, a memory we would carry in silence, woven into the fabric of our lives, yet too profound, too strange to ever explain. As we walked on, the familiar sounds of the forest returning around us, I felt a deep, unsettling gratitude that the forest had let us go. We trudged forward, the memories of what we had seen haunting our thoughts, our steps slower, each of us lost in the enormity of what we had encountered. The forest behind us seemed quieter now, a silence that felt final, as though it had already closed itself off to us, retreating back into the mysteries we were not meant to unravel. But as we approached the trailhead, something in the air changed. The usual sounds of the forest resumed, a distant bird call, the faint rustling of leaves, the gentle trickling of the creek behind us. Yet even in that comforting familiarity, I felt a slight unease, as though I were seeing it all through new eyes, each ordinary detail now tinged with the knowledge of what lay beyond. The trees around us seemed less dense, less alive, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching, perhaps not with malice, but with a lingering awareness, a reminder that we had crossed into a world that didn't want us, that had tolerated us only because it had chosen to. As we reached the trailhead, stepping onto the dusty ground that marked our return to the world of people, of concrete and structure, I glanced back one final time, half expecting to see those shadows, those shapes lurking just within the trees. But there was nothing, only the quiet, impenetrable forest that gave no hint of the secrets it held. In that moment, I realized that we had indeed returned to the world we'd left behind, but we would never truly escape the forest. It had marked us, and that mark would linger in our minds, in our dreams, and perhaps in the dark, quiet spaces of our lives where memories resurface unbidden. We had glimpsed the unknown, touched the edges of a mystery that defied understanding, and we would carry that knowledge forever, silent, yet alive, a reminder of the boundary we had crossed and the ancient presence that lay just beyond. The road back to civilization was marked by an uneasy quiet. We moved as though in a daze, each step slower than the last, our minds still tethered to that shadowed forest and the presence that lingered within it. Despite the warmth of the sun on our backs and the wide open sky above us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, as if invisible eyes traced our every move, marking the distance we placed between ourselves and that ancient boundary. None of us spoke. The usual relief that accompanied the end of an expedition, the chatter and laughter, the recounting of shared experiences, all of it was absent. Words felt inadequate, small in comparison to what we had encountered, and there was a tacit understanding among us that to speak of it too freely might invite it back, tether us to that dark presence we were trying to leave behind. The guide walked a few paces ahead, his shoulders tense, his head slightly bowed as though weighed down by thoughts he dared not share. His face, once lined with the rugged confidence of experience, now bore a haunted look, as if the years of understanding and respect he had cultivated with nature had been upended, redefined by a force that defied even his grasp. I found myself wondering what he had seen in those shadows, what revelations had taken root in his mind as he stood before that stone altar. I could sense his burden, a quiet responsibility, the unspoken knowledge that he would carry this encounter alone without the luxury of truly explaining it to anyone outside of those who had seen it with him. As we neared the trailhead, the landscape began to shift, the forest giving way to open patches of scrub and meadow, sunlight brightening the path ahead. The trees became less dense, their shapes softer, less ominous. But even in this clearing, there was a lingering sense that the forest had followed us, casting a thin thread that trailed in our wake, as if to remind us that we had ventured into forbidden territory and could not entirely break free. Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice hesitant, almost fragile. "Do you feel it too?" she asked, glancing at each of us, her eyes reflecting a strange mixture of wonder and fear. "Like it's still with us?" We all exchanged uneasy glances, nodding, acknowledging a truth we hadn't dared voice. It was there, a shared weight, a presence that felt just out of sight, hovering like an echo that refused to fade. We each felt it, an intangible connection, as though the forest had imprinted itself upon us, leaving behind a piece of its ancient soul. The guide turned, his gaze sweeping over us, his face etched with a calm resignation. "It won't leave," he murmured, confirming what we all felt. "Not entirely. We've seen it, touched something that doesn't belong to our world, and in doing so we've been marked." He paused, his eyes distant, as though gazing through time itself. "The forest will be with us, but we can choose how we carry it. With respect, with silence." A chill passed through me, but there was comfort in his words, a strange kind of solace. This experience, unsettling and transformative, had bound us together in a way that was impossible to fully comprehend. We were no longer mere strangers who had shared a journey. We were witnesses, bound by a secret that could never be fully understood by those who had not stepped into that shadowed realm. And in that understanding, a subtle strength grew, a quiet resolve to respect what we had seen, to carry it, as he had said, with reverence. As we finally stepped out onto the main path, where the faint sound of a distant car hinted at the nearness of civilization, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief to be back on familiar ground, yet a pang of sadness that a part of us would remain there, bound to those shadows, to that presence we could never truly leave behind. The world around us seemed almost too bright, the colors too sharp, the sounds too loud, as though reality itself was jarring against the darkness that still clung to us. The guide stopped, looking back at the forest, his expression one of quiet reverence mixed with an unspoken sorrow. It was a final goodbye, a gesture of respect, and we joined him, turning to face the trees one last time. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of gratitude, an acknowledgement of the forest's mystery, its patience with our intrusion, its decision to let us go. It was as if we were paying our last respects to a living, breathing entity that had granted us a rare and unsettling glimpse into its soul. We stood there, a quiet communion between ourselves and the forest, and then, almost in unison, we turned back to the path and began walking. The sounds of civilization grew louder, blending with the rustling of leaves, the gentle wind that followed us like a faint reminder of where we had been. As we reached the edge of the trail, stepping into the clearing where our vehicle waited, the guide placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm, reassuring. "Remember," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine with a gravity that made me feel seen, understood. "This is ours to keep, ours to remember. The forest has given us something, an understanding that few will ever know. Treat it with care." And as we loaded into the vehicle, the weight of his words settled over me, filling the silence with a shared promise that we would carry this secret respectfully, quietly, for as long as we lived. We drove away, but the presence lingered, a silent witness that would travel with us, woven into our lives, forever bridging the boundary between two worlds that would never fully touch, yet would always be connected in shadow. As we drove away from the edge of the forest, the road winding through the hills, I kept my gaze fixed on the rearview mirror, watching the trees grow smaller, their shapes blending into one another until they formed a dark, solid line on the horizon. The others sat in silence, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts, our own memories of what we had seen and what we were leaving behind. Yet, even as the distance grew, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of us remained back there, rooted among the shadows, bound to that ancient place we dared to trespass. The hum of the engine filled the car, a constant, grounding sound that pulled us farther from the mysteries we'd encountered. Civilization was drawing closer, the familiar signs of human presence reappearing along the roadside, rusted mailboxes, distant farmhouses, the occasional figure tending to chores in a yard. But the contrast between these ordinary sights and the memories of the forest felt jarring, surreal, as though we were returning from a dream that refused to fade. I realized that despite everything around us seeming the same, we had changed irrevocably. Sarah leaned against the window, her face pale, eyes distant as though she too were still wandering somewhere deep within the forest's heart. Every so often, she'd lift a hand to her forehead, as if brushing away invisible threads of thought that clung to her like cobwebs. Next to her, the guide sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the road, a quiet determination etched into his face. His role as our leader, our protector, had not ended. He was still guiding us, helping us bridge the gap between what we'd experienced and the reality awaiting us. As we reached the outskirts of town, he finally broke the silence, his voice soft but steady. "This will stay with you," he said, not turning around. "In ways you can't predict, but it doesn't have to haunt you. Remember it as a gift or a warning if that's what it feels like to you, but respect it. That's the only way to keep it from taking more than it already has." The weight of his words settled over us, and I realized they were as much a farewell as they were an instruction. The guide had shown us a path to understanding what we'd encountered, a way to carry it that wouldn't consume us. His voice held the wisdom of someone who had seen and respected forces beyond himself for longer than we could fathom. Someone who understood the delicate balance required to live alongside mystery without being swallowed by it. As we pulled into town, life resumed around us. People going about their day, completely unaware of the world we had just come from. The chatter, the mundane sounds, the familiar sights all felt oddly fragile, as though a thin veneer separated this reality from the darkness we had just escaped. I glanced at the others, seeing in their eyes the same awareness, a shared secret that would remain locked within us, unspoken, yet vivid, as real as the ground beneath our feet. We stopped, each of us gathering our things in a quiet daze, lingering for a moment before stepping out of the vehicle. The guide looked at us one last time, his gaze carrying an understanding that would never need words. "Take care," he said simply, nodding, before turning and walking down the street, his figure fading into the crowd, blending seamlessly with the world we had once thought we understood. As I watched him disappear, I felt a pang of loss, as though we were leaving behind more than just a place, but a piece of ourselves that had understood, if only briefly, a truth larger than any of us. I turned to Sarah, who gave a slight nod, a silent affirmation that we were bound by this experience, that we would carry it as he'd instructed, with respect, with silence, with a quiet reverence, that would honor the life of the forest and the mystery it contained. In the days that followed, I found myself drawn to quiet places, patches of nature where the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I began to understand the importance of silence, of listening to the spaces where human voices fell away, leaving room for something older and wiser to be heard. When I closed my eyes, I could still feel the weight of that presence, a shadow of the forest's ancient power resting at the edge of my mind, a reminder of the line we had crossed and the world we had glimpsed. The others and I stayed loosely in touch, exchanging the occasional message, a shared acknowledgement of our experience without ever delving too deep. There were no words adequate to capture what we had seen, what we had felt. The language of that place was beyond speech, beyond symbols, something that resided in the unspoken depths of memory, a silent understanding that each of us would carry until our last days. Even now, when I find myself alone in the quiet hours of dawn or dusk, I feel it, a pulse, a whisper, a faint echo of the hum that had risen from the earth itself. It is a memory that stirs, alive and pulsing, a reminder that somewhere in the world that forest endures, waiting, watching, knowing that those who have touched its shadows will never fully escape its reach. And as much as I try to leave it behind, I know that a part of me will always listen, always look back into the depths, wondering if one day the forest might call me again.